The first chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria begins at the zenith of its glory, long before the sky turned the color of a bruised lung. Boletaria was once the envy of the northern lands, a kingdom of high stone and heavy steel, ruled by the venerable King Allant XII. The lore of the kingdom's origin is the lore of the monumental order. Allant was not merely a warlord. He was a unifier who brought the disparate clans of the north under a single banner of prosperity. Under his reign, the Nexus was a place of silent prayer and the soul arts were a forgotten myth, suppressed for the safety of the world. The purpose of this era was the establishment of the physical dominion. Boletaria's strength was found in its grain, its walls, and its knights. It was a world of substance, and King Allant was its titan. The lore of the Great Walls reveals the architectural arrogance of the kingdom. The palace was built into the very bones of the mountains, a fortress that whispered, "We are eternal." This established the era of the impenetrable. Boletaria's knights, the elite Twin Fangs, Valorfax and Bayer, and the Tower Knight, Alfred, were the living shield of the north. Their purpose was the maintenance of the peace through might. This reveals the static purpose of the Golden Age. King Allant believed that by building the tallest walls and training the strongest men, he could freeze time and protect his people from the natural decay of empires. The rise of Boletaria was the peak of human capability, a kingdom that stood so high it began to cast a shadow over the old secrets buried beneath the earth. The relationship between Allant and the soul arts provides the first crack in the foundation. As Allant aged, his physical dominion began to feel brittle. The lore of the king's melancholy suggests that Allant looked at his aging hands and his dying friends and realized that stone could not stop death. This was the transition to the metaphysical. Allant's purpose shifted from governance to transcendence. He began to study the forbidden archives, seeking a way to feed his kingdom an energy that did not rot. This reveals the temptation of the infinite. The king's ambition was no longer for land, but for essence. He sought to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine, unaware that the divine, in the world of demon souls, is a hungry void. The physical discovery of the Nexus and the deep beneath it marks the beginning of the end. The lore of the waking of the Old One explains that Allant did not accidentally stumble into the dark. He invited it. He traveled to the frozen north and beckoned the Old One from its slumber. His purpose was the rejuvenation of the kingdom through the soul. He believed that by tapping into the source of all life, Boletaria would never wither. This reveals the tragic miscalculation of the ruler. Allant thought he was harvesting the sun, when in reality, he was opening the door to the abyss. The rise of the soul arts in Boletaria was the inhalation of the fog that would eventually choke the world. Furthermore, the lore of the colorless fog represents the biological erasure of the kingdom. As the fog rolled over the mountains, it did not just bring monsters, it brought nothingness. The purpose of the fog was the softening of reality. It dissolved the borders between the living and the dead. This was the era of the fading border. The high walls of Boletaria became irrelevant as the soul-starved began to emerge from within. This reveals the irony of the fall. The kingdom was not conquered from the outside by an enemy army. It was consumed from the inside by a hunger that Allant himself had, federal. The lore of the soul-starved, the commoners who lost their minds to the fog, provides insight into the cannibalistic purpose of the Old One. The Old One wants souls, and it uses man to hunt man. This reveals that the Great One's purpose in Boletaria was the conversion of life into energy. The kingdom was no longer a society, it was a harvesting field. This turns the history of Boletaria into a record of the butcher's shop, where the king was the head butcher and his knights were the tools. The rise of the demon was the end of the citizen. The act concludes with the silent cold that settled over the palace as the first demons, the Phalanx and the Tower Knight, manifested from the souls of Allant's own legends. The lore of Part 1 establishes the golden age of Boletaria as the gilded mask of the void. It was a perfect kingdom that was shattered by the weight of its own king's desire. The hunter or slayer of demons realizes that the fall was not a catastrophe, but an appointment. Allant had made a contract with the deep, and the colorless fog was the ink. The legacy of Boletaria's peak in this chapter is the horror of the high place. We realize that ambition in the north was just a longer fall into the dark. The purpose of the kingdom was to magnify the human soul until it was bright enough to attract the great hunger. As the fog settles over the first archstone, the Slayer understands that the history of Allant is the history of the spark, a spark that lit the fire that consumed the house. The second chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria marks the moment the Golden Age was choked by the colorless fog. As King Allant XII ventured into the frozen reaches to beckon the Old One, a thick, unnatural mist began to pour over the mountains like a slow-moving tidal wave. This was the inauguration of the nightmare. The lore of the fog's arrival is the lore of the silent erasure. It was not a violent storm, but a heavy, chilling presence that muffled the screams of the dying and turned the bright banners of Boletaria into gray, tattered rags. The purpose of the fog was the isolation of the soul. It cut the kingdom off from the rest of the world, creating a pocket reality where the laws of nature were superseded by the soul arts. The history of the first archstone is the history of how the protectors became the predators, and how the kingdom's greatest champions were the first to be hollowed by the mist. The lore of the Twin Fangs provides the most intimate look at the fog's corruptive efficiency. Valorfax and Bayer were the dual pillars of Boletarian strength. When the fog arrived, Valorfax, the swift Fang, realized the magnitude of the catastrophe. His purpose shifted from defense to the desperate warning. He was the only one to escape the fog to tell the world of Boletaria's plight. However, his counterpart, the heavy Fang Bayer, remained behind, eventually becoming trapped in the slumber of the dungeons. This reveals the fracturing of the shield. The fog's arrival split the strength of the kingdom. It forced the heroes to choose between fleeing the truth and being consumed by it. The rise of the fog was the fall of the Brotherhood of the Fang, proving that even the strongest human bonds are brittle when the soul is at stake. The physical transformation of the Boletarian Palace, 1-to-1, provides insight into the degradation of the order. As the fog settled, the common foot soldiers, the dreglings and slaves, were the first to lose their humanity. The lore of the soul-starved madness suggests that the fog acts as a solvent. It dissolves the will and leaves only the hunger. This was the era of the cannibalistic century. The purpose of the fog here was to recruit an infinite army. The soldiers who once stood guard to protect the citizens now patrolled the ramparts to feed on them. This reveals the economy of the abyss. The Old One does not need to import monsters. It simply upcycles the existing population into soulless husks. The rise of the dregling was the death of the citizen. The relationship between the fog and the red and blue dragons represents the bestial magnification of the fall. The lore suggests that these dragons were once the noble symbols of the Allant dynasty, perhaps even pets or guardians of the royal stables. Under the influence of the soul arts, they grew to monstrous proportions, becoming environmental hazards rather than protectors. Their purpose was territorial denial. They were the fire that guarded the fog. This reveals the subversion of the sacred. Everything that Boletaria prized was turned into a weapon against those who remained sane. The rise of the dragon was the cremation of the palace courtyard, where the kings of the air became the sentinels of the void. Furthermore, the lore of the blue-eyed and red-eyed knights represents the hierarchical corruption of the military. These elite warriors were the pride of the north. The fog did not turn them into mindless dreglings. It turned them into demonic vessels. Their eyes glow with a cold, malevolent light, the sign of the demon. Their purpose was the enforcement of the harvest. They stood at the choke points of the palace to ensure that no soul could leave or hide. This reveals the disciplined horror of the fall. The order of Boletaria remained, but its soul had been replaced by a predatory logic. The workshop of the paladin had become the slaughterhouse of the demon. The lore of the archstones themselves, the physical monuments left behind, represents the geological anchor of the curse. Each archstone was a gift from the monuments of old, intended to limit the fog. But Allant's greed turned them into portals for the infestation. The purpose of the first archstone was the establishing of the beachhead. It was the anchor that held the dream of Boletaria to the marrow of the earth. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the static grave, where the land itself was cursed to remain in a state of eternal decay. The rise of the archstone was the final nail in the coffin of the north. The act concludes with the first demon encountered by the Slayer, the phalanx, a mass of shields and spears clinging to a central goo. The phalanx is the literal amalgamation of the palace guard. The purpose of the phalanx was the collective despair. It represents the soldiers huddled together in the dark until they merged into a single monstrosity. The Slayer realizes that the demons are not aliens. They are the condensed grief of the kingdom. The rise of the demon is the final shape of the Boletarian army. The legacy of the fog's arrival in this chapter is the horror of the familiar. We realize that evil in Boletaria was just good that had been muffled. The purpose of the fog was to turn the mirror on the kingdom, showing Allant that his grand palace was just a gilded cage for souls. As the Slayer steps through the first fog gate, they understand that the history of the fog is the history of the breath, a breath that freezes the heart and melts the mind. The third chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria moves deeper into the inner sanctum of the palace, confronting the titan of the gates, the Tower Knight. As the colorless fog solidified its hold on the kingdom, the physical might that King Allant XII had once used to protect his people underwent a grotesque magnification. This era is defined by the lore of the monumental obstacle. Standing at the end of the Lord's path, the Tower Knight represents the purpose of the absolute embargo. He is the spiritual and physical remains of Alfred, the highest-ranking knight of the king's inner circle. His transformation reveals the cruelest aspect of the Old One's purpose, to take a man's virtue of protection and twist it into a mandate of slaughter. The history of the Tower Knight is the history of the Fortress of the Iron Will, where the shield became a crushing weight and the guardian became a gatekeeper of the grave. The lore of the Knight Alfred provides the human tragedy behind the metal. Alfred was known as the Iron Will of Boletaria, a man whose loyalty to King Allant was as unshakable as the mountains themselves. When the fog arrived, Alfred did not flee. He stood his ground at the inner gates. The lore of the Unbreakable Vow suggests that the Old One rewarded this loyalty by granting Alfred the size to match his duty. This was the ascension of the Sentinel. His purpose shifted from defending the king to denying the truth. The Tower Knight exists to ensure that no one reaches the inner palace to see the rotted reality of Allant's throne. This reveals the sealing purpose of the demons. They are the locks on the doors of the past. The rise of the Tower Knight was the fall of human proportions, proving that in Boletaria, greatness had become deformed. The physical design of the great shield carried by the demon provides insight into the defensive despair of the fall. The shield is not a tool of active combat, but a wall of stone. The lore of the immovable object explains that the Tower Knight's purpose was the psychological demoralization of the hero. When a traveler sees a knight that towers over the very buildings of the city, they realize that human effort is futile. This was the era of the stagnant defense. The demon does not seek out enemies. He waits for them to break themselves against his iron. This reveals the passive aggression of the Old One's purpose. It wants the world to give up and lie down in the fog. The rise of the Great Shield was the closing of the path to redemption. The relationship between the Tower Knight and the crystal lizards and archers on the ramparts represents the ecosystem of the siege. The Tower Knight is not a lone combatant. He is a centerpiece of a military machine. The lore suggests that the archers surrounding the arena are the ghostly echoes of Alfred's personal battalion. Their purpose was the multi-layered execution. While the knight crushes the front, the archers pick off the weak. This reveals the tactical cruelty of the fall. The demons remember how to fight as a unit. This was the era of the organized nightmare. The order of the Boletarian military was preserved, but it was infected with a soulless precision. The rise of the demon army was the final perversion of the Boletarian drill. Furthermore, the lore of the Lance of Light represents the arcane adulteration of the martial arts. Alfred was a physical warrior, yet his demonic form can project spikes of soul energy from his weapon. This reveals the invasive purpose of the soul arts. They pollute the steel. The purpose of the light lance was the reach of the abyss. It showed that even if a hero stayed far away, the demon could touch them. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the stretching dark, where safety was an illusion that could be pierced by a god king's ghost. The rise of the light spear was the end of the fair fight. The lore of the iron demon soul, the item dropped upon his defeat, represents the marrow of the machine. The soul is tough and unyielding. This reveals the petrification of the spirit. Alfred's soul had become as hard as his armor, losing all humanity in the process. The purpose of the iron soul was the hardening of the scourge. It provided the weight necessary to anchor the fog to the physical world. This shows that the history of the Tower Knight is a history of the statue, where a man's legacy was turned to lead. The rise of the iron soul in the hands of the Slayer is the only way to forge a weapon capable of shattering the gate. The act concludes with the silent collapse of the giant. When the Tower Knight falls, the dust of his armor chokes the courtyard. The Slayer realizes that there was no man inside the suit, only mist and memory. The purpose of the Tower Knight was to be the monument of the king's hubris. He was the statue that Allant built to his own strength, and his fall is the shattering of the king's ego. The Slayer understands that the inner palace is now exposed, and the true horror of the Red Moon is waiting behind the next fog gate. The legacy of the Tower Knight in this chapter is the horror of the imposing silence. We realize that duty without soul is just a mechanical meat grinder. The purpose of the Workshop of the North was to make men into walls, and the Tower Knight was the final wall. As the Slayer walks past the hollow helmet of the fallen giant, they understand that the history of Alfred is the history of the shield, a shield that protected the Wound until it festered into a world-ending rot. The fourth chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria ascends the blood-stained steps to the inner ward, where the vicious grace of the kingdom's elite becomes a nightmare of silver and crimson. Here stands the Penetrator, the demonic transfiguration of Metas, the Lance, one of the three legendary knights of King Allant's inner circle. While the Tower Knight represented the immovable shield, the Penetrator represents the lore of the irresistible edge. His purpose is the sanitization of the sanctum. He is the personal assassin of the corrupted throne, a being whose sole existence is to pierce the heart of any hope that remains in Boletaria. His transformation reveals a terrifying truth about the Old One's purpose. It does not just bloat the flesh into giants. It sharpens the human will to kill into a fine, lethal point. The history of the Penetrator is the history of the corruption of the King's Blade, where chivalry was distilled into execution. The lore of the Knight Metas provides the tragic foundation for this dealer of death. In the Golden Age, Metas was the king's swift justice, a man whose speed with a blade was said to be faster than the fog. He was the surgical strike to Alfred's blunt force. When the kingdom fell, Metas did not succumb to the slow rot of the dreglings. He embraced the soul arts to reach a pinnacle of technique that was previously impossible for a mortal. The lore of the sanguine perfection suggests that his purpose shifted from justice to pure lethality. He became the demon of the thrust, a being that no longer fights but erases. This reveals the elitist purpose of the fall. The higher the knight's rank, the more focused their demonic hunger becomes. The rise of the penetrator was the fall of the fair duel, proving that in the end, Allant's best men were merely better monsters. The physical design of the penetrating sword provides insight into the aerodynamic sadism of the fall. The sword is unnaturally long, needle-thin, and glows with a pale, malevolent moonlight. The lore of the thirsting point explains that the weapon's purpose was the negation of the armor. In the history of the North, heavy plate was the sign of safety. The penetrator was designed to mock that safety. His lunge can traverse the entire arena in a heartbeat, bypassing the great shields of the heroes. This was the era of the vulnerable knight. This reveals the psychological cruelty of the old one. It wants its victims to know that there is no shelter from the king's will. The rise of the penetrating blade was the death of the defensive philosophy. The relationship between the penetrator and the fat officials, the smiling, corpulent sorcerers of the palace, represents the sycophantic hierarchy of the fall. While the penetrator provides the steel, the officials provide the cruelty. The lore suggests that the penetrator acts as the muscle for these ministerial demons. Their purpose was the systematic dismantling of the citizenry. Together, they turned the inner ward into a processing plant for souls. This reveals the administrative horror of Boletaria's end. It was managed with gleeful efficiency. This was the era of the smiling tyrant. The order of the kingdom was not broken. It was weaponized against the very people it was built to serve. The rise of this triumvirate of terror was the final betrayal of the social contract. Furthermore, the lore of the silver armor represents the preservation of the facade. Unlike the rotted wood of the valley or the decayed flesh of the swamp, the penetrator remains polished and bright. This reveals the vain purpose of the king's inner circle. They wanted to look like gods, while they acted like beasts. This was the era of the gilded rot. The purpose of the silver plating was to hide the emptiness. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the mask, where the more beautiful the surface, the deeper the corruption within. The rise of the polished demon was the end of the moral compass, where beauty and evil became indistinguishable. The lore of the silver demon's soul, the item dropped upon his defeat, represents the sharpness of the sin. The soul is focused and cold. This reveals the freezing of the empathy. Metas had pushed his skill so far that he had severed his connection to human feeling. The purpose of the silver soul was the refinement of the scourge. It provided the intellect behind the violence. This shows that the history of the penetrator is a history of the needle, where the scourge was injected into the veins of the world with pinpoint accuracy. The rise of the silver soul in the hands of the slayer is the only way to learn the art of the divine thrust. The act concludes with the silent bow of the fallen duelist. When the penetrator is defeated, he does not scream. He dissipates into a cloud of silver dust. The slayer realizes that they have not killed a man, but extinguished a technique. The purpose of the penetrator was to be the ultimate test of the slayer's reflex. He was the gatekeeper of the king's person, and his fall is the shattering of the king's guard. The slayer understands that the throne room is now unprotected, and the true face of King Allant is waiting at the top of the elevator. The legacy of the penetrator in this chapter is the horror of the vicious grace. We realize that skill without heart is just a beautiful murder machine. The purpose of the workshop of the palace was to make men into swords, and the penetrator was the final blade. As the slayer steps over the broken rapier of the fallen knight, they understand that the history of metas is the history of the edge, an edge that cut the world until there was nothing left to bleed. The 5th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria reaches the apex of the palace, the throne of the sun, where the hollow divinity of the kingdom is finally revealed. Here sits the false King Allant, a being of terrifying poise and radiant power. However, the lore of this encounter is the lore of the divine impostor. This is not the true King Allant 12, but a demon twin, a construct of pure soul energy molded in the image of the king at his most glorious. The purpose of the false king is the eternal preservation of the lie. While the true King Allant retreated into the bowels of the old one, he left this simulacrum to rule over the ruins. His transformation reveals the ultimate nihilism of the fall, that the king's final gift to his people was a spirit of purest malice wearing the mask of authority. The history of the false king is the history of the abandonment of the flesh, where the icon became more real than the man. The lore of the simulacrum provides the philosophical core of the kingdom's collapse. The true Allant grew weary of the futility of human endeavor. He saw that even the greatest kings eventually rot. His purpose shifted to the transcendence of identity. By creating the false king, he extracted his own greatness and ambition, leaving his humanity behind to be consumed by the old one. This was the birth of the absolute tyrant. The false king possesses no mercy, no doubt, and no regret. He is the platonic ideal of a king, a being that exists only to rule and destroy. This reveals the satirical purpose of the fall. The old one took Allant's highest aspirations and turned them into a god of the void. The rise of the false king was the fall of the human king, proving that perfection is just another word for death. The physical combat style of the false king provides insight into the lethal elegance of the soul. He moves with a stately speed that defies the laws of physics. His signature technique, the soul sucker, allows him to literally drain the levels of the slayer. The lore of the regression of the spirit explains that the false king's purpose is the erasure of progress. He does not just kill the body, he deletes the history of the hero. This was the era of the Great Reversal. It reveals the spiritual predation of the Allant dynasty, a king who feeds on the potential of his subjects. The rise of the soul-sucking king was the end of the heroic myth, where experience is just another resource to be harvested by the throne. The relationship between the false king and the storm of the wings, the dragons and the gargoyles of the spire, represents the celestial sovereignty of the fall. From his high perch, the false king commands the sky. The lore suggests that the white fog at the top of the palace is his exhale. His purpose was the creation of the divine vacuum. By standing at the highest point, he ensures that the souls of the entire kingdom rise toward him. This reveals the atmospheric horror of Boletaria's end. It was an inverted funnel, where every drop of life in the streets was being sucked into the spire. This was the era of the vertical harvest. The rise of the false sun was the drying out of the earthly kingdom. Furthermore, the lore of the soul brand represents the manifestation of malice. While the true king carries the demon brand, the false king wields a blade of pure intent. The lore of the blade of the will suggests that the weapon's power is inversely proportional to the character of the wielder. This reveals the inverse purpose of the Allant era. He sought power through depravity. The purpose of the sword was the cleaving of the reality. It showed that evil could be bright and beautiful. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the optical illusion, where the brightest light in the kingdom was actually the center of the darkness. The rise of the shimmering blade was the death of the discernment. The lore of the false king's demon soul, the item dropped upon his defeat, represents the weight of the crown. The soul is radiant and cold, lacking the warmth of a living being. This reveals the crystallization of the hubris. Allant had turned himself into a gemstone. The purpose of the false soul was the solidification of the scourge. It acted as the capstone of the archstone of the king. This shows that the history of the false king is a history of the statue, where the ruler became a monument to his own hatred. The rise of the radiant soul in the hands of the Slayer is the only key to opening the final seal of the Nexus. The act concludes with the final breath of the impostor. As the false king dissipates into golden particles, he whispers of the mercy of the Old One. The Slayer realizes that they have defeated the shadow, but the substance is still waiting. The purpose of the false king was to be the ultimate distraction. He was the beautiful lie that kept the world from looking into the ugly truth. The Slayer understands that the throne is empty because the king is no longer king. He is a parasite in the belly of the beast. The legacy of the false king in this chapter is the horror of the hollow divinity. We realize that authority without empathy is just a beautiful executioner. The purpose of the workshop of the spire was to make a god out of a monster, and the false king was the final product. As the Slayer looks out from the broken spire over the choked horizon of Boletaria, they understand that the history of the false king is the history of the mirror, a mirror that showed the kingdom what it wanted to see until it broke. The 6th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria descends from the airy spires of the palace into the suffocating, subterranean heat of the Stonefang tunnels. If the palace was the mind of the kingdom, Stonefang was its body, the industrial engine that fueled Allant's expansion through the relentless extraction of ore. The lore of this era is the lore of the subterranean grind. The purpose of Stonefang was the mechanical sustenance of the north. For generations, the excavators, a race of hardy, long-lived miners, toiled in the dark to provide the iron for the Tower Knight's armor and the hardstone for the palace walls. However, the fall of Boletaria brought a molten corruption to these depths. The history of the Stonefang tunnels is the history of the greed of the excavators, where the search for resource became a worship of the flame, and the miners were forged into the very tools they once wielded. The lore of the excavator's stagnation provides the industrial tragedy of the district. These were not slaves in the traditional sense, but a people whose entire identity was the dig. When the colorless fog seeped into the tunnels, it did not find faith or chivalry to corrupt. It found toil. The lore of the endless shift suggests that the fog locked the miners into their labor. Their purpose shifted from mining for the king to mining for the void. The scale miners you encounter are hollowed by their own diligence. They continue to pick at the walls even as their flesh turns to stone and their eyes go blind. This reveals the automated purpose of the fall. The Old One takes the routine of a civilization and turns it into a cycle of eternal exhaustion. The rise of the stone miner was the fall of the worker's dignity. The physical environment of the smithing grounds provides insight into the thermodynamic horror of the fall. As the soul arts permeated the rock, the natural heat of the earth became sentient. The lore of the fever of the deep explains that the purpose of the tunnels became the incubation of the primal fire. The fat officials seen here, the same ministers from the palace, were sent by Allant to oversee the production of souls. They used whips and fire to overclock the miners. This reveals the administrative greed of the Allant era. He did not just want he wanted the heat of the human spirit to be smelted into power. This was the era of the human foundry. The rise of the molten industry was the charring of the kingdom's heart. The relationship between the miners and the armor spider represents the industrial trap of the fall. Tucked away at the end of a narrow tunnel, the spider acts as a biological gate. The lore suggests that the spider was a natural predator of the tunnels that was magnified by the fog to act as a security system for the deep. Its purpose was the filtration of the intruder. By weaving webs of steel and spitting fire, it ensured that the secrets of the excavation remained buried. This reveals the claustrophobic purpose of the Old One. It wants its larders to be hard to reach. The rise of the demonic arachnid was the sealing of the mine, turning a place of work into a tomb of web and ash. Furthermore, the lore of the dragon stone and the clear stone represents the mineralization of the soul. In Stonefang, The soul does not float in the air. It hardens into crystals. The lore of the geological echo suggests that these ores are the condensed memories of the ancient dragons that once ruled the earth. The purpose of the excavation was the resurrection of the primeval. Allant realized that if he could dig deep enough, he could find the power that existed before man. This reveals the archaic purpose of the fall. The history of the future was being unearthed from the grave of the past. This shows that the history of Stonefang is a history of the drill, where the search for knowledge was replaced by the search for the spark. The lore of the filthy man, the merchant found at the entrance, represents the parasitic remnant of the industry. He hoards scraps and ores, waiting for a slayer to trade. His purpose is the exploitation of the decay. He is the human face of the greed that destroyed the tunnels. He doesn't care about the demons or the king. He only cares about the profit of the pile. This reveals the petty nihilism of the fall. While the gods are fighting, the small men are stripping the copper from the walls. The rise of the filthy scavenger was the end of the community, where survival became a transaction. The act concludes with the discovery of the great dragon in the lava pits. As the slayer descends further, they find the remains of the ancient ones being reanimated by the fog. The purpose of the Stonefang tunnels was to be the cradle of the flame god. It was not a mine, but an altar built to beckon the flame lurker. The slayer realizes that the miners weren't digging for iron. They were digging for their own destruction. The rise of the heat is the final fever of the buried city. The legacy of Stonefang in this chapter is the horror of the smothering heat. We realize that industry without rest is just a self-hammering anvil. The purpose of the workshop of the earth was to turn men into ore, and the fall was the final smelting. As the slayer wipes the soot from their brow and looks into the orange abyss, they understand that the history of the excavators is the history of the pit, a pit that swallowed the sun and gave back only cinders. The 7th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria ignites within the crucible of the core, where we encounter the most viciously active entity in the Stonefang history, the Flame Lurker. While the Tower Knight was a statue, and the Penetrator was a needle, the Flame Lurker represents the lore of the unbound kinetic. He is a primal demon, a being of pure combustion and violent energy that resides in the massive temple at the heart of the tunnels. His purpose is the forging of the apocalypse. He is the living engine that keeps the Stonefang fever at a boiling point. The history of the Flame Lurker is the history of the bound demon, an ancient power that was chained by the ancestors of the miners and unleashed by the soul hunger of King Allant. The lore of the ancient ceiling provides the historical weight of this encounter. Long before Allant, the Big M, the legendary smith deity of Stonefang, realized that the primal fire of the earth was too wild for man to control. The lore suggests that the temple where the Flame Lurker resides was originally a prison. The pillars of stone and the lava pits were designed to dampen his heat. His purpose was to be a passive battery for the forge. However, when the colorless fog arrived, it dissolved the chains. The Old One awakened the Flame Lurker, turning his energy from productive to destructive. This reveals the volatile purpose of the fall. The Old One does not create evil. It removes the inhibitions of the primal forces. The rise of the Flame Lurker was the meltdown of the industrial heart. The physical combat of the Flame Lurker provides insight into the relentless entropy of the fall. Unlike other demons who have patterns or logic, the Flame Lurker is erratic. He pounces, explodes, and slashes with a frenzy that suggests he is burning himself out. The lore of the infinite combustion explains that his purpose is the acceleration of the end. He represents the panic of the dying kingdom. This was the era of the thermal collapse. This reveals the chaotic purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants the heat to be uncontrollable. The rise of the fire demon was the shattering of the forge's discipline. where the hammer was replaced by the explosion. The relationship between the flame lurker and the legendary smith, Ed, found at the top of the tunnels, offers a poignant look at the fading craft. Ed is the only human who remembers how to work with the heat of a demon. The lore of the searing knowledge suggests that the flame lurker's soul is the only thing capable of transcending the steel. This was the era of the demonic blacksmith. Ed's purpose is to harness the sin to make the slayer stronger. This reveals the transmutative purpose of the fall. The history of Stonefang moved from hardstone to searing soul metal. This shows that the only way to survive the fog was to become as hot as the demon itself. The rise of the advanced forging was the final testament of the human will to compete with the apocalypse. Furthermore, the lore of the red-hot demon soul, the item dropped by the flame lurker, represents the catalyst of evolution. The soul is pulsing with a life force that refuses to die. This reveals the will of the ember. The flame lurker was not soulless like the dreglings. He was oversouled. He had too much life for his body to contain. The purpose of the red-hot soul was the igniting of the potential. It allows Ed to unlock the true history of the weapons, turning a scrap of iron into a godslayer. This shows that the history of the flame lurker is a history of the spark, where the demolition of the old world provided the heat to forge the new one. The lore of the dragon god's presence, hinted at in the architecture of the flame lurker's arena, represents the hierarchical heat. The flame lurker is merely the acolyte. He stands before the great ribs of the dragon god, guarding the final secret of the earth. His purpose was to be the sentry of the bone. He ensured that only the hottest soul could witness the origin. This reveals the theological purpose of the Stonefang fall. The miners were unearthing a god, and the flame lurker was the burning veil that protected the sacred. The rise of the fire was the preparing of the altar for the archdemon of the flame. The act concludes with the extinguishing of the brand. When the flame lurker falls, the lava in the pits seems to dim. The slayer realizes that they have stolen the fire from the engine of the north. The purpose of the flame lurker was to be the test of the pure will. He was the obstacle of energy, and his fall is the cooling of the king's ambition. The slayer understands that the bottom of the world is now reachable, and the dragon god is waiting in the ash. The legacy of the flame lurker in this chapter is the horror of the unstoppable aggression. We realize that power without control is just a beautiful conflagration. The purpose of the workshop of the deep was to capture the lightning, and the flame lurker was the lightning that escaped. As the slayer holds the glowing soul of the demon, feeling the heat seep into their gauntlets, they understand that the history of the flame lurker is the history of the blast, a blast that cleared the way for the end of the world. The 8th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria reaches the absolute floor of the world, where the subterranean heat of Stonefang gives way to the ancient weight of prehistory. Here, the slayer confronts the dragon god, the archdemon of the second archstone. While the flame lurker was the active fire, the dragon god represents the lore of the fossilized divinity. He is a being of such titanic proportions that he is woven into the very architecture of the cavern. His purpose is the territorial assertion of the primeval. He is the source from which the flame lurker and the stone miners drew their molten strength. The transformation of this ancient fossil into a living nightmare reveals the old one's ultimate archaeological cruelty. It does not just create new demons, it reanimates the sovereignty of the past to crush the presumption of the present. The history of the dragon god is the history of the end of the industrial era, where man's machinery was used to execute the very god they tried to unearth. The lore of the primordial fossil provides the foundation for the geological terror of this encounter. In the ages before the first king of Boletaria, the dragon god was the apex of the world, a being of magma and bone, who eventually became the mountain. The lore suggests that the Stonefang miners were not just digging for or They were grave robbers. They built their smithing grounds atop the ribs of a god. His purpose was to remain a silent foundation. However, when the colorless fog saturated the rock, it jump-started the heart of the earth. The Old One recalled the dragon god's will. This reveals the restorative purpose of the fall. The Old One undoes the civilization of man by restoring the dominion of the beast. The rise of the dragon god was the death of the geological peace. The physical nature of the encounter, a stealth mission through debris, provides insight into the human insignificance of the fall. Against the dragon god, sword and shield are toys. The lore of the scale of the divine explains that his purpose is the total negation of the individual. One sigh from his nostrils is a firestorm. One punch is an earthquake. This was the era of the crushing reality. This reveals the humiliating purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants the slayer to feel like an ant. The rise of the stone god was the final proof that Allant's industrial ambition was a child's game played on the back of a sleeping giant. The relationship between the dragon god and the massive ballistae, the godslayer spears, represents the irony of the engineering. These weapons were built by the ancestors of the miners, the Big M, not to kill the god, but to keep it bound. The lore of the shackles of the spear suggests that the industrial workshop was originally a containment facility. The purpose of the ballistae was the maintenance of the grave. It is the ultimate irony that the slayer must use man's tools to finish the job that the fog interrupted. This reveals the cyclical purpose of the fall. Technology is the only thing that can clean up the mess that ambition created. The rise of the Godslayer spear was the final act of the Stonefang engineers, proving that man's greatest invention was a funeral rite. Furthermore, the lore of the dragon demon soul, the item dropped by the archdemon, represents the inertia of the infinite. The soul is immensely heavy and radiates a heat that never cools. This reveals the permanent consequence of the fall. The dragon god's soul is the root of the flame. The purpose of the dragon soul was the anchoring of the element. It provided the weight necessary to keep the tunnels from collapsing into nothingness. This shows that the history of the dragon god is a history of the anchor, where the demolition of the god provided the foundation for the slayer's ascension. The rise of the colossal soul in the hands of the slayer is the only way to fuel the highest arts of fire and wrath. The lore of the lava pits, which dry up upon the god's death, represents the thermal exhaustion of the district. When the dragon god dies, the blood of the earth stops flowing. The purpose of the dragon god was to be the heart of the industry. Without him, Stonefang is just a cold hole in the ground. This reveals the resource dependency of the Allant era. The kingdom was feeding on a corpse, and once the corpse was exorcised, the kingdom had to starve. This was the era of the cold ash. The rise of the silent cavern was the final shuttering of the workshop of the north. The act concludes with the final groan of the crumbling deity. As the dragon god shatters into obsidian dust, the archstone of the Digger King is purified. The Slayer realizes that they have toppled a landmark of the universe. The purpose of the dragon god was to be the ultimate ceiling of the material world. He was the physical limit of power, and his fall is the shattering of the earth's pride. The Slayer understands that the second pillar of the Old One has collapsed, and the Tower of Latria is waiting in the chilling rain. The legacy of the dragon god in this chapter is the horror of the ancient weight. We realize that progress was just scraping the surface of an indifferent divinity. The purpose of the workshop of the earth was to wake the god, and the fall was the price of the alarm. As the Slayer stands on the shattered jaw of the fallen deity, they understand that the history of the dragon god is the history of the mountain, a mountain that looked down on man until it was turned into a monument of its own defeat. The 9th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria shifts from the sweltering pits of industry to the rain-slicked, suffocating silence of the Tower of Latria. If Stonefang was the body, Latria was the mind, the seat of wisdom, ivory artifice, and the aristocratic elite. The lore of this era is the lore of the intellectual despair. The purpose of Latria was the refinement of the human spirit, a place where the queen of the land ruled over a society of scholars and artists. However, the fall brought a spiritual infection far more insidious than the physical rot of the palace. The history of the Tower of Latria is the history of the madness of the Golden Garb, where the search for truth was replaced by the obsession with pain, and the seat of learning was transformed into a vertical panopticon of eldritch horror. The lore of the exile of the queen provides the cultural tragedy of the district. The Queen of Latria was a figure of grace and purity, but she was usurped by her own husband, a man known only as the Old Monk. The lore suggests that the monk was banished from the ivory towers, only to return draped in a living, parasitic golden robe. His purpose shifted from governance to the systematic humiliation of the intellect. He cast the queen into the fog and turned her ivory towers into iron cages. This reveals the vindictive purpose of the fall. The Old One uses resentment as a catalyst. The monk did not just want to rule Latria, he wanted to deconstruct it. The rise of the Old Monk was the fall of the Latrian dignity, proving that knowledge without empathy is the shortest path to divine madness. The physical environment of the Prison of Hope, 3-1, provides insight into the acoustic horror of the fall. The tower is filled with the ringing of bells and the moans of the damned. The lore of the measured suffering explains that the purpose of the prison became the rhythmic extraction of sanity. The mind flayers, the squid-headed jailers, patrol the halls with magic and bell. Their purpose was the policing of the thought. They do not just guard the body, they paralyze the soul. This reveals the cerebral purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants to free the mind from its human constraints by breaking it through repetitive trauma. This was the era of the Iron Maiden. The rise of the jailer was the death of the student. The relationship between the prisoners and the fool's idol represents the theological trap of the fall. In the grand chapel of the prison, a beautiful, four-armed woman preaches a gospel of hope. The lore suggests that the idol is a clockwork mockery, created by the monk to look like the missing queen. Her purpose was the maintenance of the false hope. By giving the prisoners a false god to worship, the monk ensured they would never rebel. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the Old One. It uses religion to harvest the devotion of the desperate. The rise of the Clockwork Queen was the sealing of the Latrian spirit, turning a sanctuary into a theater of deception. Furthermore, the lore of the man-eaters and the heart of the tower represents the biological blasphemy of the upper reaches. In the swampy, fleshy depths of the towers, the monk began to synthesize life. The lore of the meat of the mind suggests that the massive beating heart, suspended by chains, is the engine of the monk's power. The purpose of this gore engine was the industrialization of the soul. It creates the gargoyles and the man-eaters, unnatural hybrids of human and beast. This reveals the experimental purpose of the Latrian fall. The mind was used to overthrow biology. This shows that the history of Latria is a history of the scalpel, where the search for enlightenment was replaced by the assembly line of the monstrous. The lore of the sage freak, the visionary, the prisoner found in the cells, represents the dangerous curiosity of the scholar. Freak seeks the soul arts not to serve the Old One, but to understand them. His purpose is the intellectual theft of the fire. He is the human reflection of the monk's ambition. He realizes that magic is a primal force that can be weaponized by the will. This reveals the immoral purpose of the fall. Knowledge is neutral, but in a rotting world, it becomes a curse. The rise of the advanced sorcery was the end of the traditional prayer, where man sought to hack the reality of the fog. The act concludes with the ascension to the spire in the upper Latria. As the slayer cuts the chains holding the great heart, the physical center of the monk's delusion collapses. The purpose of the Tower of Latria was to be the altar of the ego. It was not a prison, but an observation deck for the end of the world. The Slayer realizes that the monk wasn't ruling, he was auditioning for the Old One. The rise of the Golden Mist is the final breath of the scholarly nightmare. The legacy of Latria in this chapter is the horror of the chilling isolation. We realize that wisdom without compassion is just a beautiful cage. The purpose of the workshop of the mind was to turn men into stars, and the fall was the turning of the stars into dust. As the Slayer stands on the lattice walkways under the green moonlight, they understand that the history of the monk is the history of the shroud, a shroud that wrapped the world in gold until it suffocated. The 10th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria ascends the final, spiraling staircase of the ivory tower to confront the silent sovereignty of Latria, the old monk. This encounter is unique in the history of the fall, for it represents the lore of the absentee tyrant. The man who was once the husband of the queen is now a withered, skeletal husk, slumped upon a throne of rotting ivory. The true power, the true demon, is the golden garb, a long, tattered, parasitic cloth that has wrapped itself around his body and mind. The purpose of the old monk is the testing of the surrogate. He does not fight his own battles. He summons the souls of other hunters to act as his vessel. The history of the old monk is the history of the parasitic robe, where the clothing became the king and the king became a prop. The lore of the living garb provides the metaphysical horror of the Latrian apex. The golden garb is not a garment, but a demon of influence. It is a manifestation of the eldritch vanity that the old one harvested from the monk's resentment. Its purpose was the externalization of the ego. The robe feeds on the hate of the wearer, granting them infinite arcane power at the cost of their autonomy. This was the era of the puppet king. The monk believed he was using the power of the soul to reclaim his kingdom, but the robe was using him to stabilize the fog in the east. This reveals the adulterating purpose of the fall. The old one rewards ambition by replacing the ambitious with a construct. The rise of the golden garb was the fall of the individual will. The physical nature of the battle, where the monk summons a player or a phantom to fight in his stead, provides insight into the delegated cruelty of the fall. The lore of the soul call explains that the purpose of the monk is the corruption of the savior. By forcing a hunter to defend the throne, the old monk and the robe proves that anyone can be bought or bowed by the soul arts. This was the era of the mercenary demon. This reveals the social nihilism of the old one's influence. It wants to turn the heroes against one another. The rise of the summoned rival was the final destruction of the Brotherhood of the North, turning the quest for salvation into a duel of the damned. The relationship between the old monk and the homing soul arrow, the floating orbs of light that guard the throne, represents the automated intelligence of the fall. Even as a husk, the monk's will is projected into the air as lethal geometry. The lore suggests that these orbs are the fragmented thoughts of the monk's madness. Their purpose was the defensive autonomy of the mind. The monk no longer needs to think to kill. The robe does it for him. This reveals the alienating purpose of the Latrian fall. The mind has become so refined and cold that it functions like a machine. This was the era of the disembodied wrath. The rise of the auto-sorcery was the death of the creative intellect. Furthermore, the lore of the yellow head wrap, the item gained by those who serve the monk, represents the viral spread of the insanity. To wear the wrap is to invite the robe into one's own mind. The lore of the crown of the parasite suggests that the golden wisdom it provides is a lethal injection of insight. The purpose of the wrap was the propagation of the golden cult. The monk wanted to ensure that even if he died, his aesthetic of pain would live on in the minds of the survivors. This shows that the history of Latria is a history of the infection, where the golden thread of the robe sews the nightmare into the fabric of reality. The lore of the yellow demon soul, the item dropped upon the monk's death, represents the essence of the usurper. The soul is bright, arrogant, and ravenous. This reveals the vampiric nature of the Latrian throne. The monk didn't earn his power. He siphoned it from the queen and the prisoners. The purpose of the yellow soul was the anchoring of the illusion. It was the battery for the fool's idol and the man-eaters. This shows that the history of the old monk is a history of the voided marriage, where the bond of love was burned to light the lamp of the demon. The rise of the yellow soul in the hands of the slayer is the only way to master the insanity of the homing soul. The act concludes with the silent crumbling of the monk's bones. When the robe is defeated, it does not die. It fades, leaving the frail body of the man to turn to dust. The slayer realizes that they have shattered a mirror rather than killing a god. The purpose of the old monk was to be the ultimate proxy. He was the human shield for the eldritch garb, and his fall is the shattering of the ivory illusion. The slayer understands that the third pillar of the old one has collapsed, and the shrine of storms is waiting beneath the crying sky. The legacy of the old monk in this chapter is the horror of the parasitic robe. We realize that power without personhood is just a golden shroud. The purpose of the workshop of the spire was to dress the dead in gold, and the fall was the final unraveling. As the slayer looks at the empty throne of Latria, they understand that the history of the old monk is the history of the costume, a costume that wore the man until there was nothing left inside. The 11th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria drifts away from the mainland to the jagged, rain-battered cliffs of the Shrine of Storms. If Latria was the mind, the shrine represents the spirit of the ancestors, a site of ancient, primal ritual where the shadow men worship the wind, the rain, and the great storm beast. The lore of this era is the lore of the eternal tempest. The purpose of the shrine was the sanctification of the dead. For centuries, the shadow men brought their deceased to these cliffs, believing that the storm would carry their souls to a sky kingdom. However, the fall of Boletaria brought an eldritch reanimation to these sacred rites. The history of the Shrine of Storms is the history of the burial of the sky god, where the hope of afterlife was turned into a cycle of ravenous rebirth, and the ancestors were recalled as skeletal sentinels of the fog. The lore of the Shadowman's Covenant provides the cultural foundation for the island's corruption. These were a people who did not fear death, but welcomed it as a transition. The lore suggests that they used soul remains to beckon the storm beasts to feed on the essence of the departed. When the colorless fog arrived, it overwhelmed the ritual. The Old One did not just observe the covenant, it hijacked it. The purpose of the shrine shifted from funerary honor to atmospheric consumption. The fog condensed the spirits of the dead into hardened bone, creating the silver skeletons and gold skeletons that now haunt the cliffs. This reveals the recycling purpose of the fall. The Old One uses the traditions of the past as a blueprint for its undead army. The rise of the skeleton soldier was the fall of the peaceful grave. The physical environment of the island's edge, 4-1, provides insight into the aerodynamic horror of the fall. Unlike the claustrophobic tunnels of Stonefang, the shrine is wide open to the violence of the sky. The storm beasts, giant, flying rays, patrol the air, spitting barbs of bone at any intruder. Their purpose was the patrol of the horizon. They are the hounds of the storm, ensuring that no soul escapes the island. This reveals the sequestration purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants to trap the spirit within the circulation of the storm. This was the era of the Sky Jail. The rise of the storm beast was the death of the horizon, where the sky itself became a wall of pointed malice. The relationship between the Shadow Men and the Adjudicator represents the moral mutilation of the fall. Deep within the ruins sits a bloated, golden-scaled demon with a second tongue emerging from its head and a golden bird perched atop its crown. The lore suggests the Adjudicator was the judge of the dead, who determined if a soul was fit for the storm. The Old One turned this judgment into a gluttonous evaluation. His purpose was the tasting of the sin. He eats the unworthy. This reveals the visceral purpose of the fall. The abstract laws of the shadow men were meatified. The rise of the adjudicator was the souring of the sacred law, turning a divine decree into a feeding trough. Furthermore, the lore of the old hero represents the blind loyalty of the ancestral spirit. Deep in the path of shadows, the Slayer encounters a towering, eyeless warrior wielding a large sword of searching. The lore suggests he is the primeval ancestor of the Shadow Men, a hero so ancient he predates sight. His purpose was the sentinel of the silent grave. He hears the echoes of the living and crushes them to maintain the quiet of the dead. This reveals the relentless purpose of the fall. Even the heroes of old are drafted into the service of the fog. This shows that the history of the shrine is a history of the echo, where greatness is reduced to vibration and violence. The lore of the Storm Ruler, the sword found at the monolith, represents the mythic countermeasure. This weapon, which cleaves the sky, was the only tool the Shadow Men had to control the god. Its purpose was the ritualized regicide. It was used once an age to slay the storm and reset the cycle. This reveals the self-correcting purpose of the ancient world. They knew the gods would eventually become too hungry, and they forged the solution into the earth. The rise of the Storm Ruler in the hands of the Slayer is the final acknowledgement that man must kill his own gods to clear the air. The act concludes with the descent of the Storm King. As the Slayer reaches the monolith of the sky, the clouds themselves take form. The Storm King is the archdemon of the air, a creature of pure storm and endless wings. The purpose of the Storm King was to be the vacuum of the spirit. He sucks the souls from the graves and delivers them to the Old One. The Slayer realizes that the shrine wasn't a church, it was a funnel. The rise of the Great Ray is the final harvest of the Shadowman's hope. The legacy of the Shrine of Storms in this chapter is the horror of the eternal tempest. We realize that tradition without life is just a repetitive haunting. The purpose of the Workshop of the Sky was to send the soul upward, and the fall was the slamming of the sky's door. As the Slayer stands on the shattered monolith amidst the carcasses of the storm beasts, they understand that the history of the Shadow Men is the history of the rain, a rain that washes the memory until only the bone remains. The final chapter in our 12-part chronicle of the fall of Boletaria descends into the absolute void beneath the Nexus, where the physical reality of the kingdom dissolves into the primordial fog. This is the lore of the final communion. Having silenced the archdemons of the palace, the tunnels, the tower, the shrine, and the valley, the Slayer is summoned into the belly of the Old One itself. While the previous chapters explored the symptoms of the fall, this final part explores the source. The Old One is not a monster in the traditional sense. It is a vessel of entropy, a cosmic sponge designed to soak up the spark of life until the world is a quiet, gray sea. The history of the Old One is the history of the choice of the soul's end, where the Slayer must decide if the cycle of ambition is worth resurrecting, or if silence is the only true mercy. The lore of the Great Slumber reveals the cyclical nature of the Boletarian tragedy. The Old One was not created by Allant. It was rediscovered. The lore suggests that the monumentals, the withered children found in the Nexus, once sealed the Old One after a previous soul scourge. Its purpose was the universal reset. When a civilization becomes too arrogant and bloated with soul arts, the Old One awakens to cull the excess. This established the era of the deep sleep. This reveals the environmental purpose of the fall. The Old One is a natural force of metaphysical balance. The rise of the Old One was the automatic response to Allant's greed, proving that in this universe, power always invites its own extinction. The physical encounter with King Allant 12, the true king, inside the Old One provides the most miserable insight into the human residue of the fall. He is no longer a king or a god, but a slug-like parasite, a blob of distilled regret wallowing in the internal filth of the Great One. The lore of the final sermon explains that Allant's purpose was the nihilistic surrender. He realized that life is suffering, and that the Old One is a merciful God because it ends the suffering by ending the soul. This reveals the theological suicide of the Allant era. The leader of the people decided that the people should no longer exist. The rise of the Slug King was the final degradation of the Boletarian spirit, where majesty was dissolved into mucus. The relationship between the Maiden in Black and the Old One represents the liturgy of the lullaby. She is the demon who keeps the fire of the Slayer, yet her true purpose is to put the Old One back to sleep. The lore suggests she is a sister of the Void, a being who belongs to the fog. Her purpose was the mediated mercy. She acts as the bridge between human will and eldritch hunger. This reveals the necessary evil of the fall's conclusion. The workshop of the soul cannot be destroyed. It can only be closed for the night. This was the era of the eternal vigil. The rise of the Maiden's song was the only thing keeping the nightmare from swallowing the stars. Furthermore, the lore of the soul of the Old One, the final essence, represents the potential for total erasure. It is a soul of such weight that it threatens to pull the world into itself. The lore of the ultimate temptation suggests that the Slayer has two choices: to lull the beast and become the next monumental, or to slay the Maiden and become the Old One's newest demon king. This reveals the evolutionary purpose of the fall. The hunt was a test to find a successor. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the inheritance, where the Slayer becomes the heir to the emptiness that Allant left behind. The lore of the Fog's retreat, in the good ending, represents the temporary reprieve of the world. As the Maiden leads the Old One back into the deep, the colorless fog vanishes from the lands of man. The purpose of the Slayer's journey was to be the system restore. However, the cost is the loss of the soul arts. The world becomes mundane and physical once more. This reveals the anticlimactic purpose of the fall's end. Salvation means becoming ordinary. This was the era of the silent recovery. The rise of the New World was the final erasure of the Boletarian legend. The act concludes with the silent walk of the Maiden into the deep. As she vanishes into the white mist, the Nexus begins to crumble. The Slayer realizes that they have saved the world, but lost the magic. The purpose of the Old One was to be the mirror of human want. It showed the kingdom that their desires were lethal, and its slumber is the final lesson in humility. The Slayer understands that the history of the North is over, and the age of man, unsupported by souls, has begun. The legacy of the Old One in this final chapter is the horror of the absolute void. We realize that God in this world is an apathetic stomach. The purpose of the workshop of the universe was to produce a soul strong enough to close the gate, and the Slayer was the final key. As the fog clears from the broken spires of Boletaria, the Slayer understands that the history of the Old One is the history of the breath, a breath that was held for 1,000 years and finally released into the cold, dark air.